We all had one. Maybe we still do. I'm talking about the dreaded boss. You know, the guy you can have a beer with. Maybe you can talk about soccer or baseball or even hockey, but there are some things that are off limits. I mean, absolutely forbidden. He could buy you a beer and they'd still be off limits. Hell, he can buy you a nice bottle of booze and they'll still be off limits if you're still sober enough to talk. My name is Archie, like Bunker, but Jones will do too. My wife's name is Edith. Now you see the connection and why we are often teased by our friends, neighbors, co-workers, and the lady who goes from table to table selling roses on our night outings. Archie and Edith Jones are me and my wife. We live in a big city and both make good money for the neighborhood we live in. It's warm here year-round. Only occasionally do we have to pull out the electric blanket when a cold front comes through. I think the last time we did that was but that was a long time ago. One thing I can tell you for sure is that if the AC fails, we repair it faster than a dog runs away from a catfight. We were both still very young. At that point, we had only been married a month or two after our fourth wedding anniversary. Edith and I had been together as boyfriend and girlfriend since the first day of summer vacation after my freshman year of high school. She was going to spend the summer at her aunt's house in Virginia. So before she left, we decided to promise that we would be a permanent couple by the time she returned. We sealed that promise by giving each other our virginity the night before she left. When she came back that fall, we spent a lot of time hiding from our families until we got to know each other very, very well. I mean, getting to know each other in the biblical sense. Graduation went well for both of us. We were able to get jobs, exchanged rings, and then there was nonstop sex, at least for a while. But, as everyone knows, no man or woman can live their life on sex alone, no matter how hard they try. I guess it was inevitable that we would fall into a routine. After all, we'd been together for a lifetime. And after all, it had only been a few years. For young people like us, we were just kids. A lifetime can be compressed into a month away from mom's kitchen. We had given each other our virginity and, frankly, had never tried out for another sexual partner. At least I hadn't. I couldn't speak for Edith. She was my first love, and I was hers. That's how it seemed to me. But now I realize that my perfect life was just a fantasy. The day the wheels fell off the bus was unforgettable. My wife, Edith, and I had just finished dancing. You know the dance, when she says I need to lose a few pounds and I just keep moving, so to speak. So, I enjoyed the feeling of her body pressed against me. Since we both work, we don't always have the time or mood to do what we just finished. I slid down her body a little to lick away the small pool of sweat that filled the hollow between her breasts. And then I heard the words that make a man want to commit murder, when she said, "You know what your boss told me today?" All feelings went away. "No, honey, what did my boss tell you today?" I said the words loud enough for her to hear. Don't forget that I was busy drinking the liquid of our love. She didn't even hesitate. "Bold as brass," she declared. "He said if I go to bed with him, he'll give you a promotion and a raise." I sat up so fast I must have scared her, because her knee flew up like a Saturn rocket and crushed my gonads. I didn't know what was worse. The fact that she'd said what she'd said about my boss, or the pain of having my balls in her throat. Regardless of the culprit, there was a lot of screaming, yelling, and crying. That's what came out of my mouth in the first 3 seconds. After that, I looked up from the floor and saw the shocked look on my wife's face. I hit my head on the end post, bounced off the dresser, knocked over a lamp that hit me right in the middle of my forehead. I suddenly felt like I was being held on a waterboard, and blood was running down my face. At that moment, a pain struck me in the middle of my back, and I seemed to lose consciousness. Let's not be silly. I know I blacked out. That's the only thing that can explain how I woke up to some dude in an angel costume, shining a bright light in my eyes. There was a lot of excitement, someone yelling, "He'll come to his senses." More angels appeared, more bright lights, and I was convinced. I died and went to heaven, and all these angels were throwing me a party about being among the elect. And that's when I realized it was a TOO and not a TOO. 2. One meant I was alive, and the other meant I was in heaven. The message of a wife proposal from my boss was still bouncing off my brain walls as my consciousness began to come back into focus. There were tubes coming out of my body like I was the center of the universe. The first real words I could realize were, "Calm down. There she is." When this angel entered the room, it was like the parting of the Red Sea. Everyone stepped aside as she demonstrated her superiority. She had earplugs in her ears, and she kept talking and giving orders left and right. She was holding my hands, checking my beautiful blue hair, squeezing my fingers. She pulled back the blankets, and I felt her gentle and almost tantalizing touch on my thigh. She moved to the bottom of my bed and gave me more and more orders, and I complied with each request to the fullest. Now that I knew they weren't angels at all, but a bunch of nurses and a bunch of doctors, I was able to relax. Slowly, they began to remove the wires that were preventing me from moving. Someone picked up a needle, and in a second or two, I was back in dreamland. It wasn't really a dream. I was back in that black hole again, but it was a very soft hole, and I was enjoying it. When I regained consciousness this time, I was watching television. Angels were appearing and disappearing from my world. But if the TV is to be believed, I had been a butterfly for about 2 days when I asked about my wife. You know, the butterfly emerging from its cocoon. In a very professional manner, they said she had been notified. What's going on here? I had been watching the cartoon channel on TV for the last 2 days, but my wife was still gone. In fact, they took the clicker thing away from me, so I could only watch what they, a group of angels who had now turned into devils, wanted me to watch. I'll be blunt, I wasn't getting answers to my questions. My wife was AWOL. I still had a tube in my weenie. That's what my mom called it. There was a tube that collected the nastiest smelling crap imaginable, and it all came out of me. Woo! But then came my perfect, bright, and shining truth. She would come 2 or 3 times a day and say she just wanted to check on you and see how you were doing. If she came by, it meant I was doing okay. She would look at my chart on the tiny computer, snap her fingers, and all the angels would come back to the room to take care of me. So I looked forward to her blessing me with her presence. On the 3rd day after I broke out of my cocoon, there was a rumble in the hallway outside my room. The door swung open and my wife, dressed in the latest technology, burst into my cramped space. "Oh, Archie, 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 are you all right, darling?" She crossed the room and started showering kisses all over my face. The saddest part was that none of those kisses ever grew. They were doomed to die in a circle of thick red lipstick, which I immediately started wiping off with a napkin. What does that phrase mean? Dressed to the hilt. I think when I was alive, people used to say I was dressed to a 2, maybe a 3, but never a 9. When I got my wife to calm down a bit, I saw my boss standing in the doorway. What the hell is he doing here? Don't worry, honey. Rusty brought me to the hospital when I told him about you coming out of your coma. Why would you tell my boss that I woke up from a coma if he was the one who put me in it? I don't know what expression was on my face, but it wasn't a pleasant one. I've been awake for 3 days now. Where the hell have you been? Honey, you've been gone so long. This raises an excellent question. How long have I been in my cocoon? The person who has the answer has just entered the room. My angel came for a routine visit. While I was living and breathing, Rusty, the most hated man in my life at the time, was drooling over my doctor's ass. That alone would have made me get out of bed and kick his ass. But for some reason, I couldn't move. I could only guess that the tube coming out of my weenie and the bag filled with the secretions that usually came out of my ass had something to do with it. Rusty was one of the lucky ones. At least he was lucky on this day and at this time. But the time would come. I promised myself. The time would come. Several alarms sounded and my angel doctor began clearing the room of contagion around my bed. After she finished her examination, she allowed my wife to return to the room. I then told her that if Rusty, that son of a bitch, came back, there would be a price to pay. I was then told that I had been in a coma for over 3 months. My angel told me that they had more scans of my brain and spine than the patients in the hospital. She said there was nothing wrong with the scans, but that I had severe blood loss at the time of the incident. There was a fear of brain damage, but they couldn't find any damage at that point. Apparently, I didn't have a brain, or the one I had was too strong to be damaged. It didn't make sense. After all, I was in a coma for 3 months. That's when I was told that the coma was induced to protect me from any unseen damage. The word from my angel seemed acceptable, and I calmed down a bit after learning that my wife was spending her free time with my boss, Rusty the Snake. My wife stayed around for another hour or two. It was time for a shot to calm me down and rest for the rest of the day, before meals. That injection turned out to be my freedom. I woke up a few hours later and she was gone. The next day, I was put into the operating room to have my butt reconnected, and the nurse took the tube out of my pee hole. She offered me a choice, slow and easy or fast to get it over with as soon as possible. I decided slow and quiet. At that moment, her hand twitched, my eyes glazed over, and I started chanting the mantra, "Oh, damn!" I was getting good dope, but they weren't that good. Later, when I was moved back into bed and the bleeding had stopped, I think, my wife was sitting next to the bed. My lunch was brought in while I was out of the room, but she ate it. So, being the new fresh butterfly that I am, I was able to talk a couple of nurses into calling the cafeteria and ordering something special. They brought me soft serve and gelatin. I would have killed for pizza, but I knew why they did it, and I had to put up with it or starve to death. You know what happens next. What came next was the dreaded rehab. For some strange reason, I had to relearn some things I had done all my life. I was learning to walk again. Wait, damn it, right here? I know how to walk. You just wait till you get up off the floor, and I'll show you how to walk. Fortunately, it didn't take long to sort out left and right. I was feeding myself, wearing a bib, and my wife was standing nearby, fussing about as if she didn't notice something more important going on in the world. Just go away, okay? I think I've got it all figured out. I was getting very impatient with my wife. She didn't hesitate. If I had known it would be this easy, I would have kicked her out sooner. Finally, the day came when I found my freedom. Praise hallelujah, I was on my way home. When the nurse wheeled me out to the front of the building, I was so happy. But I didn't know it wouldn't last. I knew I couldn't drive yet, but I thought my wife would respect me. As they closed the back door and I sat down, I looked at the front seat and guess who was driving? Come on. It wasn't my wife, but the guy who got me in this place? Yeah, it was a good guy, Rusty, my boss. When I saw the back of his head, I almost threw up right there in the back seat of my car. Well, it was my wife's car. But I paid for it. Doesn't that give me the right to claim it? I think it was my own stupid fault. The whole time I was in the hospital or in rehab, I never questioned why Rusty was even around. Rusty visited me in the hospital, but I think I would have done the same if one of my co-workers or friends had been injured. Of course, that makes sense. Doesn't it? Edith realized I wasn't in the mood to host and sent Rusty on his way. I received instructions from my angel, a stylish and very sexy female doctor at the hospital. I know it sounds crazy, but when I think of her, it makes me feel better. Maybe it was the fact that when she leaned in to check my eyes or test my reaction by probing parts of my body, I felt a slight tingle. I'm going to miss our flirtatious banter. Well, the view from the front of her robe was admittedly arousing. It felt a little strange walking into my bedroom for the first time since the incident. I was tired, so I was glad for the feeling of non-hospital sheets and the lack of that aroma that lets you know you're not in heaven. Unfortunately, it had been so long since I'd seen my bed that I'd even forgotten what it was supposed to smell like. That's odd, I thought. That's not the kind of stuff my wife puts in the dryer to keep everything fresh as a daisy. Well, I'm tired. I need to rest. When my strength was restored by a short nap, I entered the kitchen, following the delicious smell of the promised home-cooked dinner. What the hell is this? I thought, looking at the 2 dirty coffee cups in the sink and 2 plates of leftover scrambled eggs and hash browns. They were accompanied by 2 sets of unwashed dishes. Who adds ketchup to scrambled eggs the way I do? I asked myself. After a second or two of further investigation, I realized it wasn't my wife. She doesn't add ketchup to anything. When she entered the kitchen, I was sitting at the table. I don't think I questioned her fidelity in any explicit way. But I'll tell you what. It's not like she was the only one who had sat at my dinner table in the last 3 months. As she walked by, she leaned over and kissed my balding head. Yes, there's a spot on the back of my head that's a little less covered in hair. Do you think we should talk about the elephant in the room? I asked. She put an expression on her face like she'd climbed out of a box of Cracker Jacks. What are you talking about, honey? You don't have to make a smug face and then wonder what I'm talking about. You know exactly what I'm talking about. Heck, I don't see this man at work that often, let alone in the hospital. Caught off guard, she immediately reverted to her standard defense. I just don't know what you mean, Archie. I mean Rusty, the man who offered me a pay raise if you'd go to bed with him. That guy. Remember him? Honest to a fault. This woman acted like I'd been living on another planet for the last, albeit long, time. Archie, honey, I would never do anything like that. You know I just love you and only you. She reached across the table and put her hand on mine. Now I remember. The situation slowly began to clear up. What do you remember, honey? She asked, as if begging me to forget that question. I remember that smell on my pillow when I was resting this afternoon. I paused and looked around the room as if a light bulb had just exploded in my head. It's the same aftershave that Rusty bathes in after his shower. It's so strong, his office remembers it at work. She laughed faintly and said, These sheets are fresh. I put them on last night. That's exactly what I mean. Rusty slept in my bed last night, making love to my woman, taking advantage of my absence. Suddenly, I stood up. I was furious. I was screaming. The blood was about to drain out of my body, and and I felt myself losing consciousness. Slowly and as calmly as I could, I sat up. My eyes drilled into my wife's. I don't need to hear some nonsense about how he helped change the sheets, or how he painted the ceiling, or helped you check the mattress to make sure this one was firm enough. I need to know what the hell is going on. Edith began to cry. She covered her face with her hands and began repeating over and over the phrase, "Forgive me. Please forgive me." I had to wait a minute or two to let my mind catch up with my body. When it did, my thoughts scattered in different directions. It was hard to make sense of what I had just heard. The constant tears and pleas for forgiveness. What will this story be about? You may have asked yourself the same question. At last, I pulled myself together, and the first thing I did was to try to calm Edith down so that I could make out at least one word she was trying to say. She was crying and trying to speak at the same time, and it was just a string of words that meant nothing. Even if a human tied it all together, it would make a programmer scratch his head. So I had to wait until she calmed down enough to realize what she was trying to say. I was fired. My job, she finally managed to whisper between sobs. Okay, you got fired. When did that happen? I asked. A week before our little accident. His blood pressure rose again. You were fired and you didn't see fit to inform me. I came to see you at the plant and Rusty was there. Did you tell my boss you were fired from your job? Before you informed me, 10 more points on BP. Well, he was so understanding and everything. Yeah, he realized the way right into my bed. I was close to passing out from the pressure on my chest. But when you went into the hospital, he kept you on staff and promoted you too. Jesus Christo, woman! I practically shouted. So you've been handing out treats since I got to the hospital? Well, she paused. Actually, it was a few days before we had a little mishap. You mean you already slept with him before you told me about his proposal? My whole body was ready to explode with anger. I had sloppy seconds, and that was with my boss, the biggest asshole this side of the moon. I paused to catch my breath. I have news for you, for him, and for the whole damn world. You can all just kiss my ass. I don't think I'm sure, but I think that's where I passed out. The next thing I remember was a sexy little girl looking at me through the plastic mask I'd put on to help myself breathe. A loud siren sounded very close by. And for some reason, my wife was holding my hand. Why would she hold my hand if I wanted to knock her on her ass? The hospital checked me out. They were going to keep me overnight to make sure I didn't cause any harm. I was okay with that. Maybe I would see my special angel again. When I asked the night nurse about her, she said she'd moved to another hospital. There was no point in going to the hospital anymore. Damn. I tolerated my wife's presence in my room for a while, but then I did persuade her to go home. We could finish our quarrel another time. The next morning, I got up bright and early. I called my brother to see if I could stay with him and his wife for a few days until I could find a place to hide from Edith. The doctors at the hospital had already told me I wouldn't be able to go back to work for another 2 weeks. And even after that, I had a lot of tests to go through. But at least this time, I was getting a complete picture of my life, and I was going to clean it up, willingly or unwillingly. I was just lucky. One of the nurses told my wife about my plans, and I had to face her again. I was sitting on the edge of the bed when she walked in with a face straight out of Mad Magazine. No makeup, her hair hadn't been brushed or combed since the previous day. She was loaded for bear, and she didn't give a shit about my shit. Totally caught off guard. From my point of view, you're the one who screwed it up. I was just trying to make our life a little better. Her remark about her lover patting her down hadn't quite gotten there yet. Who patted you down? Who the hell do you think we're talking about? Rusty, you idiot. Edith was on a roll, and I knew I couldn't stop her. I think we should screw him good, don't you? She moved away from the bed and sat down on a chair. When we're done, if you want, we can call it a day, or we can try to put this mess back together. When you talk about mess, you mean you and me. You think we can set his ass on fire and then kiss and make up? You know I'm a good kisser. She smiled, catching perhaps a crack in my feeling. Showing interest in her plan to ruin Rusty's life, I asked. What are you up to? I hate to say this, but for now we'll just have to act like everything is normal. I could see the wheels of revenge spinning in her head. It took a moment or two for the word normal to be memorized. When it did, the reality of the comment hit a sour note. So you're going to have to keep screwing this guy until we come up with a plan? My hand rose into the air and swung back and forth. Before I could say anything else, my brother, his wife, and a nurse entered the room. The nurse, as one would expect a person who was changing clothes to do, waited until all the hugs and good to see yous were over before saying anything. Mr. Jones, I've made some inquiries about the Dr. Daniels you asked about. I just nodded, waiting for an answer about my angel. Dr. Daniels is at Mercy Medical Center across town, she reported with a smirk. I paused to realize the nurse's odd smirk. Is there a problem with Dr. Daniels? Not at all. She's the best in her field. But you know she works a little differently than the average female doctor. Everyone in the room realized what the nurse was talking about before I did. But the best money can buy, she said, smiling a full smile. And this ass? Same answer, she said. The stunned look on my face must have been priceless. No one spoke, but they all grinned like a monkey throwing poop at people at the zoo. Well, I'll be damned. There was nothing more I could say. I was partial to a girl who was a guy, and besides, she was a beauty. I don't think it would have been wise to make that admission when my wife, or should I say my cheating wife, was in the room. As everyone looked at me for a comment, all I could come up with was this. I was hoping that she, or maybe, if you think I was at a loss, you're right. But I kept digging that hole. Maybe I can get someone to sign an early release so I can get back to work. My brother to the rescue. Let's get out of here and find a place where we can figure this out. Just then, another nurse came in with a clipboard full of papers and instructions, and in another 30 minutes, we were on our way. I wasn't going to get in the car with my wife, so my brother and I were in one car, and my wife and sister-in-law were in the other. How bad is it? Asked my brother, John Paul. Yes, his name is John Paul Jones. We just call him JP. Without turning her face away from the window to look at him. It's really bad. What happened? Did you catch Edith cheating or something? When I turned to look at him, I saw all the unanswered questions on his face. Worry for me and Edith. I think it's, or something like that. I didn't catch her cheating. She decided to come clean on her own. How the hell does it work? He asked. Giving my brother my full attention, I told the story as I knew it so far, which wasn't much since I'd spent most of the last eternity in a coma. She lost her job and somehow confessed it to Rusty, my boss. That's all he needed. Rusty immediately stepped in and offered to help, making her an offer she couldn't refuse. I looked away, and she didn't refuse. So, what are you going to do? My marriage is a pile of crap, so I guess I'll go back on the market and see if I can find someone who's looking for the same thing I am. JP smirked. And what's that? Brother! When I realize it, I promise you'll be the second to know about it. We laughed as JP pulled his truck into the driveway. When the engine stalled and he pulled out the key, he looked at me and said, Do me one favor. Don't put this off until later. You and Edith need to sit down and decide what you're both going to do. Then we can do with Rusty what you decide. He paused, and then with the most serious face I'd ever seen on my brother, he said, It's going to be hard. It might be harder than you think. But don't drag her along thinking that you two still have a chance to get through it all. I can tell you right now, I don't think either of you have the strength to fight for what you had. I didn't think I could answer now, but he was right. I shouldn't have put it off and let her think that there might be a change of heart or any chance that we could continue to live a lie. It sounded weird. I knew she had confessed her sins, and I was willing to hide my private thoughts. Just then, Edith and my sister-in-law Pam entered the room. Before anyone could speak, John told his wife that Edith and I needed a few minutes alone. Pam caught the joke about why we needed to be alone from the look on her husband's face. Edith and I went to the basement, and I heard her full story, from her words. When I pressed her, it turned out that Rusty wasn't the first. He was more like the third or fourth. She said it was all about the shifts I was working. She couldn't help but feel lonely and confused by the signals she was getting from other men. I explained to her as best I could that all men are male dogs, and so was I. It was then that I admitted that I liked my special doctor at the hospital. At that moment, I could see that she had resigned herself to the fact that it wasn't going to work out between the two of us. When I asked her why it took me 3 days to get to the hospital when I came out of my coma, she replied that she wouldn't lie to me again. She was in Las Vegas with Rusty, and he didn't want to go home, and neither did she. So all those tears and begging for forgiveness were just a ploy to get back to me? Archie, she said in all seriousness, you hadn't been with us for 3 months, and by then I thought I'd fallen in love with Rusty. So you just stayed with him instead of coming to me? Moisture appeared in her eyes. Yes, in fact, I was sure Rusty and I would stay together. What made you change your mind? I, too, was beginning to feel the weight of my feelings. She leaned back in her chair and looked around the room as if she could find the answer on a plaque hanging on the wall. She shook her head. Rusty was in the shower in our Vegas hotel room, and then his phone rang. It was his ex-wife. I told her he was in the shower. Instead of yelling at me, she immediately calmed down and told me what I had gotten myself into with Rusty. I hung up the phone, and when Rusty got out of the shower, I told him that his ex called and wanted to know when he was going to start paying child support. At that moment, the look on her face changed from confident to hateful. That same day, I got a call from the county health clinic saying I had gonorrhea for the second time. I brushed past her remark about gonorrhea. I didn't know he had kids, I said, chuckling quietly to myself. I didn't know either. I didn't even know he'd been married before. He has 3 kids and he has to spend one weekend a month with them. For some reason, she shook her finger at me. I've been dating him for no matter how long, and I still haven't seen these kids. I don't know how old they are, whether they're boys or girls. All I know is that he's a rotten shit when it comes to his kids. What does that say about him as a person? And don't forget, he patted you on the shoulder twice. I know she saw me smirk. I just knew it. Then why did you stay with him? If I tell you, you'll get upset. You'll start screaming again, and then you'll end up back in the hospital. You know one of us is going to file for divorce after getting revenge on Rusty, I said, stating the obvious. Knowing what I know now, I don't think you can surprise me. So we can be honest with each other. For the first time since this whole thing started, I wasn't furious. I looked at her face and saw in her eyes that she was no longer the same woman I had crossed the threshold of the house just a short time ago, 4 years ago. We talked about kids, a house in the suburbs, and maybe even traveling. But it wasn't meant to be. With a profound expression on her face, she began to lay out the painful truth. Do you remember when you accepted the application for the rotating crew at the factory? Of course I remember. We talked about it before I applied. I was going to get a raise that would take the financial pressure off me. Yeah, but we didn't realize I'd be alone. With both of our jobs, we were like 2 ships passing in the night. When you worked the evening shift, the only way we could communicate was with sticky notes taped to the refrigerator. Night shifts were nights that lasted forever. The day shift, when we were both free, you did all the cute things you couldn't do the rest of the time. Tears sprang to her eyes. But the worst was when we were only together on your long weekends. It was crazy. 1 weekend every 4 weeks. It was a harbinger of trouble from the start. Suddenly, I relaxed, realizing the reality that my marriage was over. I realized that she was right. She had cheated, but I was the one who had pushed her into unbearable loneliness. Perhaps we should both take responsibility. Have you ever told me what's eating you? No, you haven't said a word. I wasn't happy either, but all you had to do was open your mouth and let me know. Did I love her enough to fight for us? We had been married for a little over 4 years. We both recognized that we were probably too young to get married. At the time, we both wanted to get away from our families. We were both raised in not the best families. Let's face it, neither of us were happy. After a few minutes of crying, trying to realize that we would no longer be husband and wife, Edith put her arms around my neck and whispered, I'm sorry. I loved you once, but I saw what was on the other side of the fence, and I couldn't resist. She paused for a second or two, then continued, no matter what anyone says, if you're looking for greener grass on the other side of the fence, it's not there. But the sex here is great. It's so great that if you get a chance to find out, don't hesitate to jump the fence. Who is this woman? I inquired quietly. This is definitely not the woman I thought I was going to spend the rest of my life with. We continued talking for over an hour. I realized it was time wasted. When she finally realized that I wasn't interested in the excuses or the details of her cheating, she agreed that we should join the others. I should probably just drink up all the memories of the few incredible, enlightening hours I'd spent listening to Edith detail her sexual adventures. All the while, she was handing over her pussy, and I was thrusting in to provide for the 2 of us. In my nightmares, I had visions of her resisting our neighbor Bobby Johnson for a full 2 seconds before dragging his ass to our bed. Of course, there was also the story of her in the backseat of her boss's car. Then she confessed how she hooked up with my boss. It was nothing like what she'd told me before. She'd gone after him. She had seduced him at a company picnic a full year before she told me about his offer of sex for a promotion. If she hadn't been fired by corporate HR for providing sexual favors to employees, she'd still be working. But no, not her. She had to fall in love with my boss, Rusty. Then she finds out that this good old boy Rusty is the biggest asshole in the Northern Hemisphere. Or so she says. When we walked into the family room, all I saw were a few empty beer bottles and 2 very impatient people. Well, guys, you've got this revenge thing figured out, so we can get down to business and call it a day. My brother was the first to ask. How the hell do you think we're going to figure this out? We don't even know this guy. That's when my ex-wife took the initiative to tell everyone the details of what she knew about Rusty and what we were up against. I shared what I knew, and when all was said and done, no one knew the asshole better than they did before. Everyone had another round of beers and agreed to meet up in a week. In the meantime, I would stay with John Paul and his wife. As far as Edith was concerned, I didn't give a damn. I waited until the following week to call the lawyer to talk about the divorce. I found his name and number at the bus stop. He handled divorces at what I thought was a reasonable price. Of course, by this time I was willing to pay anything to get rid of Edith. The next morning, I called Edith to let her know my decisions about the divorce, and she said she would agree to whatever I thought was fair. Look who's talking about fair. I lived in a world of hard work and masturbation, and she lived in the world of some famous or infamous porn star. I was determined that what goes around comes around. I was going to get that SOB. The evening of our next meeting was like a bad night. We each had a whole week to figure out the best way to get even with Rusty and break his back. No one had any good ideas except to shoot him as he got into his car to drive to work. We could make it look like a gang attack. The vote was 3-1 in favor of that idea. Edith was the only one who thought it was a good idea. Another beer, and I made a comment about him looking at my dear angel's ass in the hospital. I saw the lights flash, but I didn't see or understand what my comment had to do with getting even with Rusty. It took about 30 seconds to bring me up to speed, and suddenly we had a plan. First, we had to contact Dr. Daniels and then convince her to go along with our plan. I didn't think that would ever happen, but to my surprise, she was willing to do anything she might find amusing. She even gave me a glance, and when we told her who the target was, her smile grew even brighter. My comment. I think we have a winner. She looked around the room. I'm supposed to meet my beau here. I don't think he'll show up. Lucky me, I guess. Can I be tonight's audience? I raised my hand to signal the bartender to bring another drink, and she put her hand on my shoulder. I don't drink, she said. I don't date drunks. That's why I'm just waiting for my date. I wish I could say the same thing. Ever since I got divorced, it seems to be the only thing that keeps me from thinking about what my life, or maybe our lives, could have been. Imbued with sympathy, she said, You really loved her, didn't you? Looking at her face, I realized the truth for the first time. I don't think I loved her. She and I were two kids who wanted to run away from our families. We saw each other as a way to break free. It was the idea of breaking free from all the rules that only applied to us. Our parents had their own set of rules that they had to follow. We were just there to make it easier for them. Suddenly surprised by my openness. Remind me never to let you get drunk. I was just making an observation. I was a little confused. I'm sorry. But when you mentioned that I love Edith, everything fell into place. I mean the reality of the whole situation. I paused to push my glass away from me. Thank you for being here. And thank you for helping me realize that my marriage was just a ruse. A ploy to make me feel like an adult when both of us, Edith and I, weren't ready for any kind of commitment. I think you're being too hard on yourself. Your marriage wasn't a ruse or whatever you call it. You were just too young to make that kind of commitment. The large group of loud men made the noise in the bar almost unbearable. I had to yell at my new friend, but she just shook her head in confusion. Do you think your date will show up? I asked, just as the group of men broke into another loud cheer. I don't care at this point. Do you want to find someplace quieter? The look on her face was almost pleading for someone to get her away from this noise. I suggested my favorite establishment in the area, McDonald's. She shook her head and we were outside, walking and enjoying the sudden quiet. The evening air blew across my face as we walked toward Mac's house. But as soon as we were out of the protection of the buildings, the refreshing scent of her perfume wafted. It was a delightful relief from the usual street odors. Trying to keep the conversation going, I asked, Did you say you were married? Yes. Once upon a time, a million years ago. I have to admit it wasn't the happiest time of my life. And now you're divorced? Yep. And from what you say, you're divorced too, she replied. I stopped in the middle of the block and gently placed my hand on her arm to let her know I wanted to stop. I looked into her eyes and said, Let's figure this out. You're just gorgeous. You have curves that most women don't have, and you're put out at a bar you never go to because you don't drink? She smiled broadly. And I'm being taken to a fast food joint so we can talk about things that have nothing to do with the case. She paused. And to top it off, I'm being taken there by a man I've only seen once. How does that fit into your twisted mind? Well, I want you to know that I'm going to register for school, and I have every intention of becoming a millionaire someday. She almost burst into laughter, but then stopped herself. I hope you do. I hope you get that degree and turn it into $1 million. We both paused. You'll be a good millionaire, and I'll be able to say I once knew you. It was pretty unpleasant. But I was determined to get through to this woman, no matter what it took. We found a booth and enjoyed each other's company for a few hours when she decided it was time for her to leave. She called an Uber, and when she went outside to leave, I slipped into the car with her. "What are you doing?" she demanded. "I hope you don't think I'm just going to let you leave at sunset or moonset, or whatever it is that's going on tonight. I need to know where to pick you up for our next date," said I. The driver had to insert his 2 cents into the conversation, but the fuss was soon over when she said it was okay. She handed him the card, and in a second or two, we were on our way. "What was on the card?" I asked. "My address. He needs to know where he's taking me." A wide smile appeared on her face. "If you had asked for my address, you could have gotten a postcard too." We both started laughing. "Is your phone number on this card?" She pulled another one out of her purse and scribbled the number on the back. "Here, now you have everything you need." As she got out of the car in front of her address, she turned around and said, "If you don't call, I won't lose sleep." When Uber dropped me off at my house, the first thing I did was call the number on the back of the card. She didn't answer. She gave me the dial a prayer number. I went to bed and slept for about 30 minutes for the rest of the night. To avoid falling for her dirty trick, I stood in front of her door at 6 o'clock the next morning. I pressed the doorbell and waited for her to answer. It seemed like an eternity, but when she finally answered, I asked her if she had the wrong number or if she was trying to convert me. When she said she wasn't dressed, laughter erupted from the speaker. At that moment, my mind went to work. "I'm not here to see you dressed. Then what do you want at this hour?" I paused for a second. "Coffee would be nice." "It'll be tea." A slight chuckle could be heard in her voice. "I live in number 3 at the end of the hallway on the second floor." The door jingled, and I squeezed my way inside. After climbing one flight of stairs, I wondered if this was the best way to make an impression. I knocked on the door 3 times. There was no expected pause. The door opened. It didn't peek around the corner of the door, but opened wide. There stood a beautiful blonde woman with disheveled hair, wearing a nightgown that barely covered her thighs. I think my shock was greater than hers. From the way I was greeted, she wasn't shocked at all. "You didn't call?" She smiled and then burst into a full-throated laughter, backing away from the door to let me into her apartment. "Oh my God," I thought. "Where has this vision been all my life?" There, standing straight and full length, stood the sexiest woman I'd ever seen. Her blonde hair was thrown back because she was trying to comb it with her fingers. She was wearing an old, tattered white t-shirt that covered her body 3 inches above her knees. The fabric was old and very, very thin. Her light brown nipples showed through the fabric as if she wasn't even there. In my opinion, she might as well have been naked. She spoke first. "I thought you were going to call. You know it was the wrong number." "Yes, and I'm happy to report that you're the first person to manage to crack the code." She took my hand and led me away from the front door. "The code to get into my panties," I stuttered. "But you're not wearing panties." "It's not worth wasting time. Besides, you forgot to kiss me goodnight." "It's not because I don't want to." At that moment, she found herself in my arms. The first kiss was tender and tantalizing. The second kiss was filled with passion and desire. By the time the hour was up, she never once told me that I needed to lose a few pounds. She didn't complain when I licked the sweat off her from our lovemaking. Her lips knew ways of loving a man that I had never experienced. When I reached for a condom, she jerked her hand away. "I haven't felt a man come inside me in a long time, and you're the one who's about to do it." And I had no regrets. I could feel the walls of her passion pumping into me like her body was milking a cow or a goat. The excitement was so thrilling that I was ready for a second round before we even finished the first. The afterglow seemed to last forever. It lasted as long as we pressed against each other. We kissed in the shower and caressed every inch of each other's body. She led me through our lovemaking like a lamb being led to the slaughter. These are moments I will never forget. Fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at things, life is not a bed of roses. Jane and I spent a very happy weekend together. I was there for the incredible sex and the fact that she had furniture in her apartment and I had a bed, a few towels, and one big-ass TV. I knew Jane was about 6 years older than me, but I was still happy that I was the one giving her pleasure at night. At least I felt like I was making her happy. She came home Tuesday night, a week after I had sort of made my way into her life. And there I was in for a big surprise. She went into the bedroom, showered, and came out dressed to the hilt. Her makeup was flawless. She looked like she was going to have a good time. "You told me we were going out and I just missed it?" I asked. admiring the beauty in front of me. You're not going to... I'm out. That caught me off guard. I don't understand. I thought we were so right for each other. Yes. She glanced at her watch. I think now would be a good time to explain it to you. She put her clutch on the table and sank into the chair across from me. I've been trying to tell you from the beginning that I'm not going to be cornered like cattle or a slave at the stove. A few years ago, my husband decided to cheat on me. He didn't just cheat. He bragged about it to his friends. I did everything I could to save our marriage. We went to a counselor and did everything you're supposed to do at times like this. It didn't help because he kept seeing this woman of his, and I had had enough. I divorced him. She rose from her seat and grabbed a bottle of cold water from the refrigerator. He was having the time of his life, and I was sitting at home twiddling my thumbs. I interrupted to ask, "What did you do?" After that first night, we talked a lot about sex and sexual partners. Soon you'd think we were discussing buying a new coffee maker. It was never a taboo topic. In fact, it became quite an expected topic of conversation. She would tell me how many guys hit on her during the day, and I would let her know if I saw a great pair of legs or ass I wanted to try. Jane had her dates, and I went on dates too. We both seemed very happy with the situation. Oh, I was jealous sometimes. But mostly it was all part of the game. Jane even admitted to feeling a prick of jealousy more than once. She'd say she was thinking of playing, and we'd go out to see what would happen. Sometimes nothing would happen, but when it did, it was usually very good. We developed a large group of friends that we would play with from time to time. She went on dates, and I did the same. The most important thing in our lives was each other. Every time we played outside of our personal relationship, we rediscovered each other as the one person who meant something in our lives. One morning, Jane told me that she had heard about a new club about to open north of our town. She seemed excited at first, but as opening night approached, she began to have doubts. At least that was the impression she gave. "If you have any doubts about this new club, then we're just not going," said I, watching her pull a new dress over her head. "No, silly. I feel fine. I think we're going to have a lot of fun tonight, and I wouldn't miss it for anything." I just shook my head and agreed. It was an opportunity to have fun and meet many new people who practiced what Jane and I called lifestyle. We arrived a little late, and security was a pain in the ass for the first night. We went through introductions, payment of membership fees, and a tour of the new club. It was bright and shiny, and it was packed with people with about the same views as Jane and me. That first evening, we were in for a few surprises. When we finally settled down to see what was going on, we froze in place. On the dance floor were two people we knew very well, our housemates Bill and Alice Johnson. Bill stood on the edge of the dance floor while his wife screwed his crotch with a man much younger than her. But while Bill was watching his wife, he kept rubbing the front of his pants as if he were masturbating without taking his cock out. That was against the rules in this part of the club. "What do you think of that?" I asked Jane, pointing at Bill and Alice. "What do you think of this?" Jane pointed to the other side of the bar. Walking across the dance floor toward us were my ex-wife and her new boyfriend, husband, lover, whoever he was. "Hey Archie, how's it going?" I stood up from my seat and smiled. "I never thought I'd see you here." "See? You thought you knew me, and you knew nothing." She held out her hand to Jane, and the conversation continued. I couldn't believe what the two women had just discussed. All around us, people are going about their business, and I'm stuck listening to my ex tell Jane all the details of her life after we divorced. Edith's new buddy is throwing glances at Jane, and I'm trying to get him to leave and find someone else. Suddenly, I felt the back of Jane's new shoes slam into my shin. Then, like a quick-thinking woman, she pretended she had an urgent phone call. She made up some story about an accident, and we excused ourselves from Edith's relentless onslaught. Before I could say goodnight to her, I was dragged out of the club. As we got in the car to head back to town, I asked Jane if she was okay. "I thought you couldn't have a cell phone at the club." "I'm an EMT, Archie. They should be able to contact me no matter where I am." She spoke in a stern, staccato voice that made me think I was in trouble. I just turned my head and pointed the car back into town. When we pulled up to her apartment, she didn't say a word. Something had happened, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know about it, whatever it was. Once inside, I was sort of waiting for what was about to begin, when Jane looked at me with a very serious look. "Archie, I need to know. Do you love me?" I was stunned by her question. "Of course I love you." "Why are you asking me that? I tell you every day that I love you. I know you couldn't hear everything Edith and I talked about tonight. But tomorrow, you and I are going to be married." Now she was crying. "I never thought I would say this to any man. But you're the only one who loves me, understands me, and will keep me safe forever. So if it's okay with you, will you marry me?" Now I was crying. Well, just a little. Later that night or early the next morning, I licked away the remnants of our lovemaking. I saw something new in Jane's face. For the first time, I noticed the peace, the calm, the comfort on the face of the woman I had just agreed to marry. I wanted to see that expression on that face in my life for the rest of my days. You'd think that would be the end of all our shenanigans. Oh, my friend, this is just the beginning. Jane and I got married and we're still happy as pigs and shit. We have no kids, no pets, no prospects. We're still playing. In case you're wondering, she's on a date right now with a guy who was hitting on her while she was buying ice cream. I can't wait for her to come home and tell me about her escapade today. Every once in a while, I get to watch. She likes watching me with another woman, but I think she likes it because she knows that when I ejaculate, she'll have a chance to enjoy the pussy she just screwed. Yes, it goes both ways, but I'm still women only. As for things like limits, they still exist. You've heard the old saying, don't litter where you eat. It is as true today as it ever was. Yeah, I got my degree, but I'm just a little short of my first million. But we're working on it. By the way, Rusty and Dr. Daniels are now married. Rusty is paying alimony, and everyone wonders who the man is in their relationship. My guess is Dr. Daniels. It doesn't really matter except to Dr. Daniels and Rusty, but it's a good thing to talk about.